Thanks for joining today. This is Draft.dev's monthly webinar series. Typically fireside chat format. We go into topics in DevRel, dev marketing every month. We're actually going to be adding a new format that we're going to be doing every month too. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But today we're covering balancing open source and product advocacy. We're joined by Matt and Dewan. I'll let them do some individual intros for themselves and their job functions and shops they work at, and then we'll dive into this topic a little bit more. So, Matt, how about you kick us off with the intros?
Sure. I'm Matt McClintock, head of content at Revelo. Prior to that, I was head of marketing at Process Maker, which is where I got most of my open source experience that we'll be talking about today.
Hey, I'm Dewan. I work as a principal developer advocate at Harness, the AI native software delivery platform. I'm based out of the beautiful East Coast, New Brunswick, Canada, still single digit outside. If you know about DevRel, I do traditional DevRel work, both open source as well as product. We'll talk about that more. I worked at IBM, Red Hat, IBM all throughout my career. I focused on open source projects as well as the products. So looking forward to the chat with Matt.
Thanks for showing, guys. And if anyone doesn't know, Draft.dev, we handle technical marketing content programs for our clients. And we're always looking for new writers too. So if you're interested in writing for us, definitely check out our website. So to get a little bit more on our topic today, I think this one's interesting. I find that on this one specifically, like balancing open source communities and then marketing behind your commercial products is always sort of a tightrope to walk. Particularly like anything in dev marketing or DevRel related, you're always sort of walking that tightrope, not laying it on too thick while being relevant and keeping it educational towards your community. So I always like to start these conversations off by defining what we're talking about, right? So let's start with each of you guys, just to keep it high level, sort of move down the funnel here, defining the fundamental differences between open source advocacy and product advocacy. Dewan, would you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are different angles to define. We can define as against each other. So this versus that kind of battles. We can also look at as complementing function. And I think that's a more, helpful way of defining. The key difference here is the ownership. So whereas in open source projects, like everyone is the owner, we all have stakes in this. Whether with product advocacy, it's a you versus me. So if someone is going out there to talk about that, it's you trying to sell me something, which is not bad. It's just the fact. Of course, we can dive deeper on that, but that's one thing. I'll start with the ownership.
Yeah,
totally agree there. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, I agree for sure. I don't think it's one or the other versus. I think open source builds long-term credibility, and product advocacy is more driving near-term business goals for the most part.
Totally agree. I think in our individual conversations, we sort of touched on this, that it's been fun watching DevRel, dev marketing sort of mature. Like they started off as like very much so more of like some of the concepts you'd see in open source marketing, which is like what would be the cool kids in the block, don't want to be associated with marketing or like hard product pushes. And now you're realizing that the two sort of have to live in harmony. So how have you guys each experienced that growth, I guess, would be a next place to take this. Like within your own personal, professional careers, where have you maybe seen some tension and then see that evolve in your companies into working well together?
Yeah, so I at my previous employer, our roots were in open source. So it was a process automation startup, one of the top automation startups, and there wasn't even an enterprise business when we crossed the 1 million download threshold, which is kind of unusual. So we had a huge open source community. We had a lot of contributions, very active community. And then one day we had a user call us up that was actually a pretty big bank in Africa. And they called us up and said they were willing to pay money for support. And that was sort of the seed of building an enterprise business. So like having, that's like a great example of open source, like, being the originator of the business. So then we started with support and then professional services, and then started sort of building the enterprise version of the product. So it was very organic.
John, you got a good example on your end over there?
Yeah, so before I moved into DevRel, I was a backend Java developer, like pure Java Spring Boot, and then I transitioned as a DevOps engineer. So from that perspective, when I was trying to learn something, whether it's from docs or from like an open source project, like in DevOps and cloud, open source is everywhere, whether you know it or even if you don't know it, underlying layers, right? Like that XKCD, that if you topple something, someone is in Nebraska using a library, they is there. Now, when you use it, then you know that there's just more eyes on that. So at IBM, we were heavily contributing to one of the open source project, Tekton, Cloud Native CI/CD. Red Hat, most of the things are already built on open source. Ivan, one of the previous company I worked at, similar thing as Matt mentioned. So one of their first customers were a trucking company from Mexico, and the founders, they were a small team back then. And this trucking company, they needed a solution for their database as a service. So why? They just were confident about the open source solutions, and that was the thread that united all of this.
Makes sense. So you guys are both going to sort of spoke on like keeping organic, having it sort of act as like layers upon each other. When it comes to driving cohesion between those like two strategies or two ideas, both open source and product goals, how would you, like, if you went into a new organization, you're like sitting down to like start coming up with a plan to unite those two fronts, where would be your starting point?
Yeah, I think, transparency is like the biggest thing with the open source community, letting them know sort of like what you're doing, why you're doing it. The biggest thing you get, one of the biggest issues is always, the open source community sometimes, and you want to avoid this, will ask sort of, this used to be a feature in the open source project. Now you guys, made it an enterprise feature. And I would highly recommend not doing that. You should stick to your open source features and functionality, and sort of everything else on the enterprise side should be separate. You don't want to sort of like kneecap your open source project to try to move people over to your enterprise product. It's not going to work. It's going to anger a lot of people, and you're kind of destroying the community that got you to where you are today. So you have to treat them and give them both the same amount of love and attention. That's, to me, that is the most important thing. You can't neglect one because the other one has all the dollar signs, right?
Couldn't agree more. We see all the time companies come to us, they say like, "Oh, we're only top down, or we're only bottom up." Like, are you sure? Are you sure that's how you want to treat this? Or I'll share it. I'll take up the link while you're talking, DeLon. But there is someone that interviewed like 100 CTOs recently in our space. Like 47% of them don't even evaluate vendors anymore. They just hand it off to one of their internal engineers or SMEs to make the decision for them. So it's a balancing act. What's your take on this, Duan?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to recognizes not every company will invest on open source, and not every product will be built on open source. And that's a fact. We have to be okay with that. Not every customer will be looking for solutions that is powered by open source. Now, if I'm joining an organization, I don't want them to do open source just for the sake of open source. It has to make sense. Now, if they're in the DevTools space or DevOps space, cloud native space, it's highly likely that somewhere along the line, maybe some of their tools will be built on open source projects. And as Matt mentioned, transparency is the key. There are a few models of open source you can think of. Our open source offering doesn't have support. The paid offering does have support. So that's not a good way to frame, because then you're incentivizing not to engage for your open source projects. One way that companies have used is scale. So how much scale does your enterprise product have? Of course, there are enterprise features that the open source project doesn't have, but you should still allow the users to use the project, see the benefit, and then you can have advanced features like RBAC or other scaling features in your enterprise offering.
Thanks for the great answer. Sorry, some of the attendees just noted I was sounding a little quiet. Hopefully the mic's a little bit louder now and coming in a little bit more clear. All great answers all around, and good on catching me on noting not everyone's going to be focused on open sources. It's always definitely true. More so focused, I guess, on approaching it from you got to speak to your end users as much as you're speaking to your ultimate signers, and making sure you're approaching that correctly. So when it comes to maintaining authenticity, and this applies to both angles, how do you preserve your credibility when advocating for both open source and commercial offerings? It's sort of it's the same. Some of it's the same strategy with both, but they do definitely differ in how you approach authenticity in each. Matt, you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, I think it sort of goes back to not diluting your open source or neglecting your open source product. As your enterprise product is evolving, your open source product should also be evolving. They're just evolving in different ways. You shouldn't just, okay, we have millions of downloads on our open source project. Now we're just going to leave GitHub and we're going to solely focus on building out the enterprise business. I think developers will very much not respond well to that. You'll start losing engagement and usage. And that's horrible, because you can get so much insight into your product and what you should be doing on the enterprise side of the house from the open source side. So, for us, we learned so much from our open source community, and we continued to learn so much from them and get feedback from them that you couldn't get if you were a solely enterprise software product, right? So I think being active consistently in your open source community, no matter how successful your enterprise product becomes, I think that shows your open source community that you are dedicated to them as much as you're dedicated to your enterprise business.
I love that. Not hiding from the feedback either. I know it can sometimes be scary diving in those communities. We have clients all the time that start posting on Reddit for the first time, and all of a sudden they're having, their docs or their content tour. That's engagement. Engage with them and give them the opportunity to express themselves and take the feedback. It's quality stuff. Totally agree. What about you, Dewan? What do you think?
Totally. Adding to what Matt said, that your mechanism of getting feedback and tracking could be different, but you don't shut down the open source path and just focus on enterprise because they're paying customers. Well, your open source community, they might be your customers, not yet. They might be customers later. So for example, at Harness, we have our canny board for customers or potential customers to propose a feature. But then for Harness open source, we have GitHub, we have issues. So both avenues, they can propose features just in different ways. And we weekly do triage both issues, and we engage with both customers as well as community. So it's important to keep up the transparency as well as the communication.
Totally agree. So that's leads to the next question. And we end up getting this talking point with anything in our world, which is how do you measure all this, right? That's how you maintain budgets, maintain teams, right? Is expressing to leadership how all of this is working. So when it comes to both open source and commercial offerings, like honestly, the harder one is like open source community health. And how are you guys measuring that? Or how have you measured it in the past that's worked or resonated really well with leadership?
So I think it's engagement and contributions for sure. And if you see that start to go down, you have a problem and you need to figure out what that problem is. So yeah, how much are people in your open source community contributing? And then obviously how many downloads you're getting on your open source project. Those have been sort of the two most important KPIs historically.
There's a blog from Swix. I think most folks in developer advocacy know about the North Star, MAU or MAD, the monthly active user or monthly active developers. So from both avenues, if you track that, you're seeing the engagement. Of course, there are some things that you don't do. That is, let's say, track GitHub stars, like vanity metrics. So there's a lot of ways to trick that, but authentic data. For example, how's the growth of your community, whether it's maybe Docker pulls, although there might be some continuous integration server that's set up that boosts that number. But then how you're seeing engagement, whether in your Discord, whether it's in your Slack. Feedback is a gift. Sometimes engineering teams, they might not be active on Slack and they probably have their maybe DevRel or some other functions engaged on those committees. But good organizations, they have their engineers on those external Slack or Discord to directly get those feedbacks and interact with the users. It's not only the responsibility of the developer advocate or the committee engineer, it's the responsibility of the entire org.
I feel like that's one of the hardest things to do. Yeah, Matt, you're probably going to chime in on that. But yeah,
totally. Well, I was going to say that is a common mistake or missed opportunity is, if you're a software company with open source and enterprise, sometimes it's marketing that's sort of engaging with the open source community, and it really should be your engineers. But, so I would say to, definitely realign. If marketing is the one that are sort of constantly engaging with your open source community, that's an issue. You definitely need to get your engineers and product managers in front of that community. Maybe even pick, like, what we used to do is pick like a monthly developer advocate champion that would basically engage with the open source community. So we switched it up every month. And yes, marketing would be a part of that. They would sort of communicate to us what we needed to know, and we would communicate to them. But I don't think marketing should be leading the charge there at all. You need your engineers to know what your open source users are doing and saying. Yeah.
It's I know it's hard to get the time commitment a lot of times, but it's just absolutely critical. Your best advocates are your internal SMEs, and just doing whatever you can to get them active in those spaces is huge. And it's honestly the most successful like dev or technical communities we see out there are the ones that are able to get their internal teams involved at a higher degree. Sorry for disappearing earlier. My computer decided to freak out. So getting back on measuring success here, a lot of times, like, you got to set realistic expectations on what the goals look like and what timelines look like, right? Whether it's community development, content, anything that's tied to either these open source or product-led initiatives. it's more about long-term pipeline health, right? Like it's not something that you're going to see overnight. Well, how do you guys set realistic expectations on timelines internally when it comes to some of these initiatives?
I think it really is more about like your product velocity. Like how often are you shipping new products, like or new updating, new releases? We were always on a quarterly cadence, right? So that's like pretty regular. But if you go to a mobile team, they'll be like, we ship every week or we ship every other day or something like that. So I think it correlates to that. Like how often are you releasing new product updates? And that'll sort of inform like that balancing act.
Yeah, Clayton, you mentioned about the long term, right? I think that's where you hit the nail on the head. Is for product advocacy. Sometimes you'll see immediate returns. So, for example, there's a webinar, and you can track the number of leads on Salesforce, MQL, SQL, all those metrics you can see. But if you're a developer advocate going to give a talk at a conference, you're not going to see a paying customer right out of that talk, right? You might hear stories about some startups, and there's a CEO and founder. They might not know about developer advocacy and the real ROI. They might ask their team that, okay, you spend 5K to give a talk. Now, what's the return? Like, where is my customer? So that's a very difficult spot. So your leadership needs to understand open source. They need to understand strategy and advocacy. Then it's much easier to explain to them how the ROI works. If not, it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, I think it's also important to highlight to the executive team the open source wins that you have. So, from a marketing standpoint, I was very much in touch with our customers. I knew our customers like the back of the back of my hand. And a lot of our longer term customers started off with our open source offering, built a bunch of processes that they run their organization off of, and then got to a point where, all right, we're using this product so much, it's so critical to our business that it would probably be a good idea to get the enterprise version, get a support plan, maybe throw some pro services in there. And you need to highlight that to your executive team so they see the benefit of investing in your open source community over the long term. And it's very easy to forget to do that. So I would constantly make a point every time I'd interview a customer and learn, oh, they started off as an open source customer. They didn't even talk to us for years. That's crazy. And now they're paying 6 figures north, for our enterprise product. But for years, they built really cool stuff. They really like optimized, automated large parts of their business, tens of 20,000s, users using the open source product. So like those kinds of stories, I feel like, yes, it's not like data, right? Where you could just show reports and graphs, but anecdotally, when you're sitting with the executive team, I would always try to bring up a story, at least 1 or 2 stories every time I would meet with them.
Totally agree. Honestly, we've even seen clients that track how many users, once they hit a certain user count of people using their product at the same organization, is when they would engage them on the sales functions. They're like, okay, we've now got 10 engineers individually using this solution at this organization, and then be able to tie that to the future leads. And yeah, that just goes back to empowering your power users too, man. Like a community and content are what it all comes down to. And if you can figure out a way to give those individuals a voice, they'll be your ultimate like internal sellers for getting you guys into the door at bigger organizations. Could not agree more. So it's been a little quiet on the Q&A today. I think everyone's headed heading into the weekend a little early. So we'll dive into the practical takeaways here at the end, and then wrap this up, guys. Really appreciate your time today. So when it comes to the last couple of questions here, if an organization is just starting to balance open source and product advocacy, what's the first step they should take? Anytime we get a question that's anything like this, I always like to start with like understanding your audience first before you can really start understanding where to put your priorities. But curious to hear y'all's take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo basically what you said is, why did your open source community grow to begin with? Like, and then reverse engineer that, right? I think that's, the Simon Sinek, start with why. Why did, in our case, why did millions of people download our open source project? And what kinds of people? And sort of how do they think? And how do they think about the product? And how are they using it? And how is it contributing, to their lives as individuals or as an org? And then sort of starting there to figure it out.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, I agreed. I think like developers are the new makers. It's still true. There might be some direction from the leadership, but at the end, it'll still go to those individual engineering teams to see what tool works for them. And oftentimes, they might switch companies, but they stick to the same open source tooling. And they again suggest the same thing to their new leadership, that this works for us, so can we use this? So as Matt said, like start with why, and you'll see that the tools that your engineers are comfortable using, that has solid developer documentation, they might be doing events, meetups, underrated way to promote to developers. Yep. These are the ways that win you big deals at the end of the day.
Yeah, to add on to that, actually, one of the first things I did, so I came onto the Process Makers, the automation startup I was at for 6 years, and I joined when we were really making the push to enterprise. And one of the first things we did was create a user conference. So we had a user conference. We actually had a few. We had one for partners, one for our open source community, and then sort of like one catch-all. And I think that was like one of the best things we did, because it was, the open source product at that point had been around for 7 years, and there had never been a virtual event where 700, we had 750 people, all open source users of our product, and like a 3-hour sort of user conference where we had different talk tracks about different components of the product. And we had some like power users come on, some customers come on, some Q&A. And then we started doing that, multiple times a year. So I think, having user conferences, you might not be at a scale where you can have an in-person AWS reInvent type situation, but you could definitely have a user conference on like a webinar like this on Zoom, which is actually exactly what we used. And we had 750 people on. So it's pretty successful and very educational in terms of learning more about our open source community and using those learnings to sort of inform our roadmap.
Sorry, I keep disappearing. Google Fiverr's fighting me today. But great answers all around, everyone. What were you going to say, Dewan? Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I'll go to add to that. Like if I'm talking to the audience, if one of you is, let's say, a founder of a small startup, or even, let's say, big size company, if you're thinking that, now we have to establish an event of our own, maybe use a conference or even a meetup, it takes a lot of work to do that. You don't always have to do that. You can even engage with existing events or meetups because you all share the same audience. So for example, if you are a DevTools or DevOps tools organization, there are plenty of DevOps meetups or DevOps days probably near you. You can sponsor one of the DevOps days. You can have a booth. You can just have your engineers attend those events. And once they do, there are hallway tracks. They're talking with other engineers. And those hidden way of developer marketing are one of the more effective ways to market rather than just plain regular marketing ways.
Totally agree. We actually got a question here from Julia. She's asking some good examples of companies that you think do a good job at dev marketing, preferably early stage companies. You guys have any examples off the top of your head? Both Harness and Revelo do great stuff, but I wouldn't consider you guys early stage at this point, what each of you are doing.
I think post-hog, any sort of post-hog, I think they do some pretty interesting stuff. That one comes top of mind to me. And then, most of the other ones wouldn't be early stage. But that's sort of a newer one that is pretty interesting. They have, with any developer marketing, it's totally different than any other B2B software marketing you can do.
Right.
And I feel like they've done a really good job of understanding what developers like and, more importantly, don't like. And they have a very unique personality and sense of humor that I think really resonates with developers. And that's the most important thing.
Totally agree. The general structure, whether you're big or small, I think is pretty similar. Our clients that are most successful in large or big scales, it's just the degree to which they're doing it, but they're taking very similar paths to the same end goal, which is community and content, doing it from an authentic place. And the way you make it authentic is to have people in the actual space executing on each. That's usually what we see is the most effective way. I'll make sure the follow-up call, we've gotten an ebook on it that dives into where to put your ROI early on to make life a little bit easier to make those decisions. We'll share that. There's a couple of good books out there too on DevRel that I'll make sure our team shares and follow up. Well, I think that's the end of our calls and our questions today, guys. We sort of burned through that one pretty quick. I thank you guys for your time today. Also, everyone keep an eye out. We'll send info on it. We've got another webinar coming up next Thursday. That's more of an educational deep dive with one of our co-owners on building a dev program. And then follow Matt Dewan on LinkedIn. Matt's actually got his own webinars coming up here soon, a podcast. And Dewan, you're always doing the same thing too. So really appreciate you guys today and definitely give them a follow.